My clock says 2 p.m. Eastern, so we can go ahead and get started today as some more folks continue to trickle in. Welcome everyone to the Aurora Institute Symposium All Fall webinar series. Today's session is on When Access Isn't Equal, How the Pandemic Amplified Our Nation's Equity Gaps. My name is Natalie Slocum. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Director here at Aurora Institute, and I'll be helping to kick us off today. Thank you all for joining. We're so grateful to have you here along with our esteemed panelists. As you may know by now, we have shifted our in-person Aurora Institute Symposium to a virtual convening on October 26th through the 28th, so save the date. And in addition to that, we are hosting a series of all fall webinars leading up to that main event and following that main event on key critical issues that are facing the field. And that's what brings us here today. So before I turn it over to our presenters, we have just a couple technology pieces that I'd like to quickly mention before we get started. I invite you to please introduce yourself. We'd love to know in the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen who you are, where you're tuning in from, your organization, and maybe one hope that you have for this school year. We encourage you to also share your own insights and expertise as well. And we'll be leaving some time throughout the webinar and at the end for questions. So be sure to ask your questions there as well. And we invite you and encourage you to share what you're learning today on social media and Twitter using hashtag Aurora2020 and tagging us using @Aurora_INST. We'd love to know what you're learning and what you're taking away and sharing that with your peers and colleagues on social media as well. And lastly, we will be recording, archiving, and transcribing today's webinar and making that readily available and accessible on our website. And we'll also follow up in an email to share these resources with you. So you'll be able to refer back to today's conversations, refer back to the slide deck, and have that transcription readily available. So with that, we are grateful to have our panelists here with us today. We have Dr. Sean Smith from the University of Kansas. We have Kelsey Ortiz, also from the University of Kansas. We have Raymond Rose from the Texas Distance Learning Association, and we have Jean Sharp from the Digital Learning Collaborative. So please join me in giving our panelists a warm welcome, and I will now turn it over to Jean to get us started. Jean, over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. Excellent. Welcome. We are delighted to be part of the Aurora Institute's initiative to bring critical conversations to the education community, and we're delighted that you have chosen to join us today. Our topic for this webinar is When Access Isn't Equal, How the Pandemic Has Amplified Our Nation's Equity Gaps. COVID-19 has transformed our discussions about equity and supporting our nation's most vulnerable students. With the large-scale shift to online learning, educators have had many questions, but one that has frequently risen to the top is equity. This topic has also emerged front and center as one of the challenges districts face in supporting remote learning programs. Today, we'll discuss strategies, resources, and lessons learned on how to ensure remote learning programs support educational equity. Next slide, please. Our session today is scheduled for 90 minutes, and here's how we plan to manage our time. Following our welcome, we'll invite our panelists to introduce themselves so that you can learn about the expertise they bring to this conversation. Our session is structured as a panel discussion, and we have 4 primary questions that we'll pose to our panelists. Following each of their comments, we'll pause to address audience questions in the moment before we move on to the next primary question for the panel. We hope in this format it will offer you an opportunity to engage with the panel throughout our time together. We do expect to have additional time for your questions toward the end of today's session, as well as time for closing remarks from our panelists and an opportunity for them to share resources with you. So with that plan, let's get started. Natalie, let's move to the next slide. I am Jean Sharp, and I'm serving as a moderator for today's session, and I'm pleased to represent the Digital Learning Collaborative. For those of you who are not familiar with the Digital Learning Collaborative, this is a membership group dedicated to exploring, producing, and disseminating data, information, news, and best practices in digital learning. We invite you to visit our website to learn more. Next slide, please. And as Natalie mentioned, I'm pleased to be joined today by three of the leading experts in the equity conversation, all individuals that I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years: Dr. Sean Smith, Kelsey Ortiz, and Raymond Rose. During our conversation today, our education experts will be discussing the issue of equity pre and post-pandemic, including how educators define equity. They'll share insights that have emerged from that rapid transition to remote learning and the opportunities this shift has created for equity conversations in education. And they'll share strategies and resources on how to ensure remote learning programs support educational equity. With that, it's time to meet our panel. Let's go to the next slide. And Sean, since your image pops up first, I'm going to invite you to kick us off.
Well, good morning to some, good afternoon to the rest of us. As Jean mentioned, Sean Smith here at the University of Kansas. I'm excited to be here. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Special Education. My work centers on really technology innovation and how it meets the needs of all learners, and how through innovations we can meet and facilitate and include all learners. My work primarily in the online blended personalized learning goes back to, well, for several years. I work in the Center on Online Learning and Students with Disabilities, which was a federally funded project for several years, focused on everything from teacher development to parent empowerment to online learning in terms of design and instruction, and the list goes on. Recently, my work has continued in that manner, particularly in the areas of virtual and augmentative technologies that we can use to develop not only instruction, but also social emotional development. And I could go on, but equally important, I'm a parent of 4. I have a child with a disability that really alters my look at the world in terms of including all. So there you go.
Excellent. Thank you, Sean. Kelsey, let's turn to you next.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Kelsey Ortiz, and I am a colleague of Sean's from the University of Kansas. I also worked at the Center for Online Learning and Students with Disabilities, that federally funded grant to kind of help define the landscape of students with disabilities learning online. Out of that project was birthed the Inclusive Digital Era Collaborative, and that is a research group that works primarily with state departments of education, offices of special education, providing technical assistance, policy development, and strategic planning. Most recently, we've been involved in responding quickly to the needs of the field and going from primarily looking at policy development in virtual schools to now this quick pivot of remote learning and implications of use of technology for students with disabilities.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelsey. And let's complete our all-star lineup here with Ray Rose.
I'm Public Policy Chair for the Texas Distance Learning Association, and I actually also have a connection with Sean and Kelsey with the Center for Online Learning and Students with Disabilities. But way before that, I was part of the team that created the country's first virtual high school. So I've been doing online learning for over 2 decades. Before that, I was a civil rights specialist in the Massachusetts Department of Education. So I come at the equity piece much more from a civil rights and monitoring and compliance perspective than other people do. So I bring that to this. I wrote the first publication on access and equity in online learning for NACOL back in 2007. So I've been thinking about these issues for a long time, and I'm planning on having some fun today.
Thank you, Ray. I think you're in for a treat to hear from these experts. And let me set the context for our first question. Natalie, would you move to the next slide, please? So in a survey conducted by Education Week's Research Center, district leaders were asked in an open-ended question how they define equity. From their responses, it was clear that equity means many different things to different people. Among their responses, there is no common definition, and that's part of the greater issue. Equity means providing the same quality services in each of our 26 sites. And we want to make sure the money spent is going to help us meet our district and school goals. Education Week took their responses and categorized them. And the results suggest that educational leaders, district leaders, view equity as providing all students with high quality resources and opportunities, tailoring those resources and opportunities to meet individual student needs. Additionally, responses indicated that district leaders view equity as addressing disparities facing socioeconomically disadvantaged student groups and helping students with disabilities access the general curriculum or receive appropriate services. So let's turn to our panel and ask, how do you define equity? And has your definition of equity changed over the last several months? If so, how? And to be clear, we want to make sure that we're talking about not just about accessibility of content, rather in the broader sense, equity of access to a quality educational experience for all students. So with that question in front of you, Sean kicked us off on introduction. So Kelsey, I'm going to ask you to lead us off here.
I was hoping Ray would go first because he has a great analogy that we would like to piggyback off of. So I'm going to defer to Ray first.
So I think most people have seen the two pictures that compare equality and equity. And with equity, they have three people standing in front of a fence, a tall person who is able to look over the fence, a medium person who can't quite look at it, and a smaller person who is limited in it. Talk about equity as providing everybody with a box, talking about equality as everybody in a box, and equity as giving boxes to the different people to enable everybody to see over that particular fence. I want to change the image, have all three people being the same height. Change what they're standing on to lower the plane so that somebody has a short distance over the fence and somebody else has a much longer distance over the fence. And then we're using the boxes to accomplish the same thing to get them up. But it's not that the people have problems. There is a structure that has a problem. And so when you think about that definition and that picture of equity, think about it not just being a person problem, individual problem, but think about it as a structural issue. Okay, Kelsey.
And so I really wanted to piggyback off of that analogy because in the work that we're doing, we're hearing from local education agencies just this need to help teachers kind of rethink what it is to ensure equal opportunity to education for all kiddos, primarily through the use of technology. Often this is happening in the child's home. And so with what Ray is saying is we can't think about this from a deficit point of view, but to ensure equity, we have to think of this of from what context are we expecting these learners to access their learning opportunities. And until we train ourselves to take in the context from which we're expecting these learners to learn, then only can we appropriately respond to ensure that that we make adjustments within that context. And so for me, I'm thinking we have to consider the context from which the technology is made available to the child, and not only the child, but the entire family. And we maybe have not had to think about that in the past. And so if we look at that from a broader point of view, it's the context, the course community, the school, the infrastructure, all of that to ensure that we're giving same opportunities across the board. But then also the personal learning environment from which the child is coming from, and that we're expecting them to meet that course community. But then also I'm really seeing where we can utilize and make it more of an equal playing field by looking at the broader scope of the community at large itself and thinking outside of the walls of the school building. And we have to now, because the school building, the walls we are not accessing those in the way that we used to before. So what is it that the community itself, what does it offer to ensure that there is equal access for and opportunities for all kiddos? And so as education stakeholders, as families, as community members, we have to think on a much broader context, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you, Kelsey. Ray, do you want to respond to that, or would you like to take the end of this conversation?
At the end, I want to hear Sean.
Okay. Well, let's come to you next to respond.
So my turn? Great. So to me, equity in respect to how I define equity is in the context, of course, of instruction and learning, because of course equity has so many broad things, and certainly Ray and Kelsey have added to that. But to me, in this world that we're living in right now, where I go with equity is for specifically meeting the needs of all learners. Of course, and of course, a variety of individuals. Now, yes, I'm a faculty member in special education. I'm a parent of a child with disability, so I tend to defer over there. But of course, to me, that's a beginning place to think about all learners. In respect to that, it's providing the resources, providing the materials, providing the instruction, providing all the different elements in a manner that's available to those individuals. And I want to get to accessibility in just a moment. So therefore, there are, as we know, in order to meet the needs of all learners, there are unique needs, there are specialized needs. And therefore planning for those and designing for those and translating that over to now the hybrid blended fully online to make sure that it's not just simply available, but it's so much more in respect to the needs of those learners. Now, real quick comment, because I know we have other things to talk about, but I want to mention accessibility, because oftentimes when it comes to individuals with disabilities, and I'll at least want to speak to that for a moment, when we think of equity, oftentimes we think accessibility. Well, if it's accessible, then therefore it's available, therefore it's equitable for that group. And just very quickly, and to reinforce in the blended fully online experience, accessibility generally means sensory and physical, 508 compliance from a legal perspective. That's not appropriate, that's not available, that's not designed for the needs of all learners, particularly those learners with disabilities, because sensory is blind, physical is more mobility, sensory also is hearing. And we're not thinking of the cognitive needs that really are the majority of individuals that we really need to plan and design for. So when something's accessible, oftentimes it's a misnomer to think, oh, well, then it's available for all learners. It's probably accessible to a target group, which is really critical, but not necessarily equitable. So I could ramble about this all day, but I'll pause to let the other folks jump in.
Excellent. And Natalie, if you would you advance the slide, please? I failed to say next slide. So here's the question that we pose to our audience. And Ray, we'll let you wrap this conversation up.
So I think as you listen, you hear people talking about the equity piece, and then Sean and Kelsey added the accessibility piece. The interesting thing about accessibility is going back a little bit. When we first started talking about accessibility, people were talking about the digital divide. And then it shifted. We sort of said, okay, we've solved the digital divide. Not true, but people have said that. And then we're talking about the homework divide, which is just a variation on the digital divide. And now we're moved to digital accessibility. And I think when we're talking about accessibility here, people are still thinking about making sure that people have the tools, have the computer, have the internet access, that kind of accessibility. And Sean was getting to the other issue, which is ensuring that the content is designed to be fully accessible, and there are legal implications there, and we'll get to that as we get a little further into this. But it's that every student needs to be able to have access to those things. And I'm just going to make this piece right here. In the ideal world, this webinar would have been captioned to make it more accessible to people who have processing issues, have problems hearing and such. I know that Aurora Institute is planning on and is working on getting things captioned in the future. Future webinars will be captioned. And I know that the recording of this will also be captioned. But thinking about those issues from the start to ensure that everyone has accessibility, and it's not just people with severe handicaps. I have my TV closed caption all the time.
Thank you, Ray. This is where we'd like to pause and just see if anyone has questions around this topic that they would like to ask of the panel while we're in the moment. And I noticed in looking at the chat that a number of you have added a couple of resources or added your own definition of equity that you've shared with the group as well. So I'll pause just a second, Natalie, to see if there are any questions that come from our audience. And if we don't have any right now, we'll definitely move on to the second question and continue to keep those questions coming in as appropriate. Natalie, would you move us on to the next slide, please? And this, of course, is our second question for our panel. So when we think about this rapid shift to emergency remote learning in the spring, it was an unprecedented move to provide continuity of learning for students. There were stories of heroic efforts by teachers and school leaders, along with, as we well know, some significant challenges. As schools reopen, we are seeing commitments from district to reassure their school community that students will be provided with a quality educational experience. Next slide, please. Whoop. There we go. In fact, many districts are being very explicit about what teaching, learning, and student support will look like as we begin the new school year. Let's go to the next slide then. So panel, here's our question. How do the experiences of the spring and the commitments in the fall change the equity conversation? And more importantly, what are the steps that we will take or should be taking to change what we do going forward? And Ray, I want to start this one with you.
To begin with, and that is, what the question says, steps we will take and change that we will do going forward. I want to know who the we is in there, because I see the we as a critical component to this. It's not Sean, Kelsey, Jean, or Ray involved. There's people within the schools. And one of the frustrations that I've been having and looking at these issues is who's missing from some of these conversations. We see schools doing things without consulting parents and then assuming parents are going to be providing the services, providing the support for students. We haven't seen, in a lot of cases, the director of special education be involved in the discussions about these things. I'm not sure where the CTO, Chief Technology Officer, is involved. One of my favorites is every school is, our school system, I should say, is required to have a 504 coordinator. The 504 coordinator has some responsibility for accessibility, for access. I don't see that schools necessarily have identified their 504 coordinator, which is a legal responsibility, just like they're supposed to have a Title IX coordinator. Everybody has a Title IX coordinator, but 504 coordinator seems to be missing, should be included in the conversations, should be helping schools to think about how they are going to provide a full and quality learning experience to all of their students. It's not just a learning experience, it's a high quality learning experience. I'll pass to the next person.
Okay, right. Sean, would you like to go next?
Sure. First of all, this is a loaded question. They're all loaded, but my goodness, this is complicated. So several different directions to take. And so what I don't cover, I know Kelsey's going to cover. So, okay, Kelsey, get ready. The way I see this is several different ways. So first of all, you know, when we're looking at the spring, so much of what I heard and so much of what I think a lot of us heard from the spring experience was, let's focus on the safety of the individual. Let's focus in on the social emotional. Instruction kind of took a back seat. And over the summer, a lot of districts I've worked with, it's that shift and that realization of, oh my goodness, now as we look at hybrid or fully online for a period of time this fall, what does it mean to truly give instruction for all learners? And where I'm finding this to be particularly intriguing, and again, so many different ways of covering this, but one that is becoming very resonant to me is the fact that some districts, and I think from a very equitable perspective, are saying, wait a minute here, we have individuals with more significant needs. We have individuals that are potentially in unsafe environments at home that we need to allow access to face-to-face, while the majority, clear majority of individuals will go online temporarily. I was just with a group of parents last night in a webinar, and nationally, I'm hearing districts with individuals with more significant needs opening up their environments while their peers, same age, same grade, et cetera, are remaining home. Well, to me, that's very equitable in that planning, because those individuals like individuals with significant autism, individuals with potentially socioeconomic concerns that are at the margins, that the home is not the right environment for that fully online learning right now. And that's where some schools are really kind of altering things and planning to really get beyond the social emotional and the safety, but truly get at the instruction. Now, of course, when we go to the fully online or to the hybrid with districts that potentially can't do some of those elements, you know, it could be also planning in a manner that allows for everything from, and I'm going to get into the weeds here and then let Kelsey go, but the state of Kansas and other states are starting to reinforce these attendance policies and what it means to be present for learning. Well, that's a design and planning issue I'll get to later, or probably the other colleagues will get to later, but we need to think about that from an equitable perspective, in that, well, attendance may mean for some individuals being live online. For other individuals, it may need to be more asynchronous, and we need to plan meaningfully for that. And I'm hearing more and more districts doing that versus saying there's a one-size-fits-all for attendance. And again, I'm getting into the weeds, but I think those types of things are examples of how we need to plan for the equity and how more and more districts are thinking about that, which is very, very important for all our learners. Go ahead, Kelsey.
Kelsey, I think you're on mute.
So I'm really right in that same line of thinking with Sean. So when I'm thinking about responding back after a really chaotic spring and then moving forward, I think about there are several bullets of where in my mind we have to kind of reflect back and then make a very mindful decision on, one, how do we mobilize? And from the state perspective, I have seen that states that were able to quickly mobilize across regions, pull in key stakeholders to be able to provide just-in-time resources and information for planning to take place, are able to get the information straight to districts and, most importantly, teachers, parents, families, caretakers, so that we can get a plan in place. So one, how do we mobilize? That's really important. Two, how do we plan response that's just in time and that's ongoing as there are needs that crop up that we haven't anticipated? So that mobilization is that we get groups together and that it's a cross section and that it is stakeholders that represent all voices is really important, and that we try to anticipate possible issues that come up. But what about the issues that we didn't anticipate that we know were going to come? And how are we going to, what's our response plan for that? and that it's just in time and it gets to the stakeholders that need it the most. And then I think about what is our plan moving forward in partnering with families and caretakers of all children, but like what Sean's saying, of children that have high needs or that are more at risk than most children, or that need more intensive therapies or care. How are we partnering with families and caretakers to ensure that we are truly providing those equitable learning opportunities? And that requires some forethought. And again, that's going to evolve as we move through this process because it's brand new for us. But we need to be very mindful and intentional in anticipating that it's a new type of partnership and it's going to be very organic, but it needs to be intentional and it needs to be fair and it needs to be unique and individualized to the needs of those specific families. And then lastly, I think we need to rethink individualization. So for students with special education needs, they all are entitled by the federal law an individualized education program. And that program specifically articulates what individualized supports that they need. We need to rethink that in the new learning context. And we need to consider factors that maybe we didn't have to consider before. For an example, how do we get students who need in-person therapies when school buildings are shut down? And who are those persons that are going to reach across those barriers to get to those kiddos so that they don't digress and so that there's no harm done, but instead that we continue to help those students prosper during this time. So maybe those 4 main points is really important right now to consider.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelsey. I've been watching the chat here and I just want to draw your attention to a number of things that are happening in our discussion as well. Some of you were asking about universal design for learning, and Derek has posted a resource for you there. Also, Barbara posted a post to an article that she has written about ULD that some of you might want to take a look at in more detail. And Mary Beth has shared a comment, which I will share with the panel because we always like positive feedback along the way as well. She shares that this is an excellent webinar thus far. Thank you for discussing critical needs of our students during the pandemic. And finally, I want to pull out, Kate has just asked about ELL considerations. So that one I'll open up to the panel and ask you, how does ELL considerations play into this as well? Anyone?
I'll start. I think the issue goes back to our district's thinking about these issues, and I think Sean made the point that it was sort of in the spring, people started just thinking about safety. And I will argue that that's good for some of the school districts, but we're aware of a couple of school districts where the superintendent said, well, if I have to have school in session, I have to provide services for special needs students. So we're just not going to have school in session. And luckily, State Department of Education got involved and corrected that. But we're looking at people who are thinking about all the issues at one side, and I think Sean has made a good description of the districts that are looking to address all students. There are school districts that aren't thinking about that. They're treating everybody as the same. They're thinking about equal, not necessarily equity. And the ELL students can benefit a lot from a variety of accessibility tools, but school districts need to be thinking about that. And I think Kelsey's point, we need to be thinking about different definitions to provide ways of providing services to students. It means for people who have been running schools and are used to a brick and mortar situation where everyone is going in, the people who are running the schools have been successful in a brick and mortar setting, and they're just trying to replicate some of that, or they're looking at a remote teaching situation, remote learning situation, and they're still trying to replicate what's gone on in the classroom. Sean mentioned taking attendance. Taking attendance, I think, goes way back to measuring seat time and assuming that you have to be in a seat to learn, as opposed to what we know from virtual education. You don't have to look at seat time to know that people are learning. And so there are a variety of issues that people need to be thinking about differently. And unfortunately, the people who are in policy positions, who are thinking about schools in remote instruction situation, haven't had the experience, the knowledge, the training, the preparation to be thinking about this new world that we're in. And that is a piece that's going to be hard, and we're going to need policy leaders, people in places like the Texas Education Association, Kate, hi Kate, to be looking at the policy changes that need to happen and not replicating what we've been doing for the past 100 years, but to think about it differently. I'm off the soapbox.
Well, either of our
Hold on. Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
I think it's an excellent question. I see this as a silver lining, folks, and that is that during the spring, and I'm generalizing here, but oh my goodness, Zoom, right? Zoom just blew up, and we had educators that went from face-to-face one day to fully online the next, and Zoom was very popular because, well, I'll just do it this way. Over the summer and coming into the fall, I'm hearing from and working with a number of districts that we're really thinking about redesigning. So we're thinking about digital tools in a so different way that, to me, the silver lining is the fact that, okay, wait, I have individuals that have language issues, individuals that have language issues identified by disabilities, and a host of things goes on. Well, there's a number of different tools, everything from text to speech that will read the text out loud, and those tools that actually will help with annotated notes, highlighting, vocabulary lists, those things are an automatic component, and then integrating those into a redesign of my instruction. So for example, millions of teachers, if not thousands of teachers, have been exposed to what blended learning models, as Ray has said, he's been doing this since the dark ages, or at least since the 20th century. But this idea of blended learning is a model. It has a number of different components that we can design around, and then bringing in frameworks like universal design for learning. And it's not just simply a list of options, folks, but it does offer options. It does offer us as educators to say, from an assessment perspective, we're going to give the learner a variety of options. Oh, I'm a student, an EL student, or I'm a student with a disability. Options are a very good thing. So instead of just one way of sharing what I know, I have a variety of ways that could potentially get around my temporary language concerns or my overall processing concerns, et cetera, et cetera. So from a silver lining perspective, it's asking us as educators to redesign and replan. And in doing so, it's doing it for all learners. There's frameworks out there to facilitate it. And then the digital tools that allow us to do it, oh my goodness, I didn't know that was sitting on my child's computer or my child's device. This is a no-brainer. Of course, they're going to use word prediction when they're writing, where prior to the pandemic, we weren't even thinking about some of those technology or we didn't have access to some of those technologies. I could ramble about this all day, but I do see a number of silver linings here.
Excellent. Thank you, Sean. And Sean has also posted a resource that some of you might want to take a look at as well. The schoolvirtually.org site has a number of resources on ULD that will be useful for you as well. Natalie, I think we'll go on to the next question. So as we think about, and as we know, the equity gaps contribute to achievement gaps, and the pandemic drove change in terms of how we do school. Add to that the recent social unrest that is occurring in cities across the country. And as one speaker at a recent webinar that I attended said, we have cracked open the door of equity. So from your perspective, how have these events amplified our country's equity gaps? And what are the imperatives to provide equitable opportunities for all students? Sean, I'm going to come to you first to lead off this one.
Well, I could talk about redesigning and planning and things of that nature, but I'll let that's something that we briefly covered a moment ago. You know, for me, there's a number, again, these are excellent questions, a number of different ways of answering it, but I want to piggyback on something Kelsey mentioned, and particularly to that second bullet from your perspective, what needs to be done to provide equitable opportunities. I think that, again, the silver lining on this is that this is, and I'm not talking spring, folks, and I want to be clear here about this family, adult in the home, parent engagement. And let me clarify where I'm going with this spring. In the spring, if we heard from anything from parents and family was, oh my goodness, it's on my shoulders, I'm overwhelmed, I'm overloaded. Well, where I'm looking at for the fall with the hybrid and fully online and everything in between is that we are now, as educators, we have to engage families and adults, regardless of typically developing those with disabilities and everyone in between, at a level that potentially we haven't done in the past. I think of a principal that I served on several committees with for over the years. And I remember one meeting particularly where he said, Sean, and he was a middle school principal, if a parent does not enter my building in the 3 years their child is here, and as long as they get the child to school on time and pick them up when they're supposed to, I'm a happy camper. And my eyes just, whoa, what about all this data about parent engagement and the la, 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 those, but it's requiring us now to interact and communicate in a manner that, first of all, communication is just not school to home, it's home to school. And of course, it's learning about the issues at home. And there's a lot of variability at home. And we need to plan and be able to plan and design around that. But it also, that's different for me for the fall, is we need to empower. To me, the educators I've been working with over the summer, the focus has been, yes, we have more stakeholders now. You may have seen your class as a group of 25, 30 students or 120 students, depending on the grade level you teach. Well, now you need to think of the stakeholder, the family member at home, particularly in the hybrid fully online, because you're going to depend upon them. You need to purposefully empower them. Now, what do you mean, Sean? Well, it could be the fact that that video model I create for a flipped classroom that's meant to help with 6th grade math for an individual is also created in a manner for that parent that might be after work sitting down and trying to help that child with their homework in a traditional sense, can now take a look and get inside my head as an educator through the video model presentation I offered. I used that for years with my children because a number of the schools my children attended were doing blended learning during the early part of the 21st century. But that's an element there that as an educator, I could meaningfully plan and say, yeah, I'm creating this for the student, but it could also empower the adult at home. But it also could be how I interact with the adult. It could also be the fact that, yes, there's variability amongst the families I'm working with. So some I need to be planful in this manner, others I need to be planful here to be more equitable and not treating them all alike. And of course, depending upon where we are in terms of urban, suburban, rural, and everything in between types of settings. But I see this as a role we need to take on as educators. But honestly, after the pandemic, which we hope will end soon, I see this as a continuation. The use of Zoom and digital tools to have more virtual office hours, the use of texting and email and phone calls to connect with adults when they're available. The fact that education just isn't in the context of 8 to 3 or 7:30 to 2:30, but it's more of a 24/7 potentially type of experience. I see these as positive things and potentially being more equitable. Thanks for letting me talk about that.
Thank you, Sean. Kelsey?
I can respond to this, maybe even referencing back to our last question about what about English language learners. If we just even take that example when we're thinking about inequity and how the pandemic kind of put inequities under the magnifying glass, we think about if there were issues with cultural insensitivities in the K-12 system, those were amplified when we had to pivot and go remote. Maybe that, I have the example of my daughter who is 50% Hispanic. Her grandparents don't speak English, and she's aware of those issues. She said, Mom, we had a new student come in from Mexico, and the teacher told him that he needed to go find his interpreter and to ask her a question. He had to leave the room. And she saw where he missed out on instruction because he had to walk the halls and find his interpreter. And I'm thinking, how does that translate when we have to be remote and go online? And I think about, we have to, again, think about inequities from the lens of being culturally sensitive and responsive to unique needs that maybe we didn't have to prior, or even more interesting, we should have been prior. We didn't have to. We found a way to sweep it under the rug, but now we cannot. Otherwise, that kid literally is going to have no exposure to any type of instruction, whether they can access it content-wise, hardware-wise, software-wise, or not. And then I also think one of the things we can also address specifically with inequities that the pandemic kind of brought up is really, truly, what are the roles of the different stakeholders that have a stake in K-12 education? How did they get into those roles? And do we need to rethink those positions? Are there roles and jobs and tasks and ways that we can care for our students that we haven't thought of yet, that are brand new, that are more appropriate for this 21st century type of learning, that will indeed bring more equity and access to all learners, as to where before maybe that K-12 system and the brick and mortar setting we would compensate for, or would just go without being addressed. And so those are some things to think about.
Thank you, Kelsey. Ray?
I'm pleased that you're able to work with schools that are planning ahead. But we've got colleagues who talked with superintendents over the summer who said, everything's going to be normal. We don't have to worry. We don't have to do any planning. We don't have to help prepare teachers to teach in a remote situation. And those schools and those kids and those parents are in trouble. And there is a major issue there that we need to be thinking about. And unfortunately, not everybody is as good as the school districts that you've been dealing with, Sean. But I want to raise a different issue. And that is George Floyd's murder brought to the white majority some attention to the fact that there has been white privilege and discrimination against blacks for a long period of time, and that we're finally sorry about that, I should have been turned off, that those issues needed to be addressed. We have not yet mentioned that we have students, black students of color, who have been traumatized by that event, and we damn well better be taking care of them in schools. And the schools that are ignoring that are doing serious disservice. And I will piggyback on what Kelsey was saying. Some of the people who are in leadership positions don't understand those issues. And we need to broaden the perspective. We need to broaden who is out there working with kids. We need to make sure that we are providing equitable access to a broader population, and that's the people that are teaching, the people that are administrators, the people who are policymakers.
Thank you, Ray. This actually, I want to share a comment that Derek has posted, because I think in context, it touches on what all three of you have talked about. And he speaks to what he refers to as the conundrum here. Uh-oh, it just flipped up. Hang on a second. I've got to scroll to get this whole comment back. Here we go. The conundrum here is that we're trying to implement processes and policies targeting individuals within a system that is based on the factory model, which is structured around groups and classes and learners progressing through a uniform manner. This is a key part of what we're confronting with the emergency remote situation and the prospect of hybrid futures, because of our factory mindset supported by policy and legislation is part of the problem. So let me pause there and let any of you on the panel who would like to respond to that to do so.
You hit it there.
Okay, very good. So Ray, I do want to share another comment from Barbara, because Barbara says, yes, Ray, there are systemic and societal issues bigger than access to digital resources. There is structural racism that has now been exposed and needs to be addressed. The system was set up as part of a factory model with teachers responsible for learning. We need culturally responsive support for teachers and families for equitable strategies, training and resources, and policy changes. So thanks to our audience for continuing to add really nice dialogue to what our panel is sharing as well. let me, without seeing anything else in the chat box right now, let me go on to our last question for the panel. So Natalie, I'll ask you to move forward on the slide. And panel, districts are increasingly focused on providing opportunities for all students. They are revisiting their selection of instructional materials, their policies and practices across 3 dimensions: diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm wondering if you would share with our audience, given your expertise, what are some of the problems, challenges, opportunities that you've been involved with over the past 5 months? What has been some of your real primary focus? And how are those conversations from your perspective furthering the equity conversations? And candidly, what do you see as emerging needs that school leaders and teachers will need to grapple with? Phew, there's a lot there. Kelsey, do you want to start?
So I think for me, from my perspective, being an advocate for students with disabilities and our research coming from virtual schools, there are some things that we know are tendencies when we move a student with a disability who has an individualized education program from a brick and mortar setting where special education services were received in that learning environment. When we move to a remote or online setting, that services tend to drop off. And so one things that we think about is, what's happening during that transition from brick and mortar to going to the home learning environment and then receiving instruction through some kind of digital application. And then how is that impacting the delivery of special education services? Because we know that without those special education services, those students are not receiving equal opportunities to receive benefits from their education. In short, for special educators, they're denied a FAPE. So the special ed services are critical, but during what we've seen in the past and even now, and these are making national headlines, is those services are dropping off. And so for us to have to think about, again, do we need to rethink individualization? Do we need to think about how special ed service delivery needs to shift? And then how do we do that in a way of where we don't deny the student a FAPE? And are there ways that the technology can enhance the educational experience for the learner? And then what are the barriers that could possibly be posed to that learner where special ed services, additional special ed services may need to come into play? And so for an example, I'm talking a lot about we can't go into an assumption that a kiddo with a disability has the technology competencies necessary in order to access that learning content. We cannot assume that they are able to operate within a learning management system without explicit instruction and training. And we cannot assume that once they're in that they don't need specific assistive technologies in order to access the learning activities. And so those are really subtle nuances that can be lost in a pivot that as advocates for students with disabilities in online learning environments, we have to really watch for. And we have to be really careful to monitor those kiddos really closely. And again, have a plan for how are we going to respond? This is not working. This piece of technology or this program is not actually serving the purpose that was originally intended, which is mentioned in that Dear Colleague letter from the Office of Civil Rights that says, when a district adopts technologies, educational technologies, every learner must be able to enjoy the original intent of the technology. And that doesn't mean if the learner cannot access it that they get a paper pencil instead. No, it means we from the beginning of the adoption of the technology, we think about all kiddos and all of the possible ways that students can access regardless of what the impact the disability has. And so that is something that we will, an ongoing conversation that we'll need to have at all levels of education, my opinion.
Thank you, Kelsey. Ray, let me turn to you next.
So I've been talking about accessibility and online learning for a number of years. And as we watched with the pivot in the spring, teachers were going out and just willy-nilly, not willy-nilly, but in some panic, grabbing digital resources because they were going to have to be teaching in a remote fashion. And some of the survey data now, I'm not going to say research, says that teachers were making decisions on those pieces of technology based on what was easiest for them to use, not necessarily what was of greatest benefit to student learning. Some of that has changed, some of that has not changed. Again, it depends on whether you're looking at the schools that are doing a really good job or the schools that are just sort of muddling along. And I think we've got a responsibility here to provide assistance to all of them. But the starting point, and I mentioned the 504 coordinator earlier. If you're in a school district, you should know who your 504 coordinator is. That 504 coordinator should have had some training and should be helping you with accessibility issues. If they are not doing their job. So that's one step here. School districts are purchasing digital resources. They are legally asked, might I say required, to review those materials to ensure that they are accessible, and if they are not accessible, to not use them, so that every student can get benefit. And we're not just talking about the students with the severe disability issues, but our enforcement agency, the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, definition for accessibility that they use in compliance. And I think it's in the resources packet that we've got down there, but I'm going to just quote it. And Kelsey hit on it. Those with a disability are able to acquire the same information and engage in the same interactions and within the same time frame as those without disabilities. So it's not go get a pencil and do that work. It's figuring out how to provide rich learning experiences for all students within the situation. So that's a piece that I think is really important. And if you happen to be in a school system, you might ask people if they're looking at something called a VPAT, VPAT, Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. I have fun. I go in to talk with vendors, especially at shows, and I ask them for their VPAT. If they know what I'm talking about, I feel pretty good about the product and know that it's going to have some sort of connection with accessibility. When I get a vendor that doesn't know what a VPAT is, I start off assuming that their product is probably not going to be able to be fully accessible, is not going to be usable by every student.
Thank you, Ray. Sean?
Sure, so I'm going to continue with my theme, and I see myself as a bit of the silver lining, maybe some rainbow, and raise the dark thunder clouds booming down. So there you go. All right, so we're going to continue with that theme. So I guess with the districts, go ahead, Ray.
Do you want to change that picture that you just created?
Sure, you're right, as I was mentioning it. So I'm gonna go with just the benefits I'm seeing with blended eye and line and what's happening today. And we'll just stay there. You're right, the analogy was inappropriate, and sadly, talking on my feet, I'm not thinking of a better analogy, but thanks for that correction, Ray. The focus for me, and what I'm hearing, not focus for me, what I'm hearing from districts and the issues that they're trying to tackle are a variety of things. And overall, it's going to go back to that planning and designing. And the positive elements I'm hearing are the fact that planning and design for all is thinking about everything from What do we need to do if we have face-to-face? What are we going to maximize in face-to-face? And what can we facilitate over effectively in blended or hybrid? And that's a lot of conversations going on right now. So for example, I'm going to do the practice, I'm going to do the facilitation of reinforcement. We can do that online for a variety of learners. But that initial instruction, the understanding of elements, we have to do that face-to-face, be it reading, math, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also then starting to explore the purposeful uses of the digital technologies that both Kelsey and Ray alluded to. And so by really thinking, playing, designing in a purposeful manner. Now, that goes into lots of different areas. So for example, assessment. It's thinking of that instead of that traditional maybe multiple choice and essay, it's looking at the tools and other variations of the solutions that are available to think about, well, to begin with, I'm finding more and more school districts are talking, let's use rubrics. Rubrics are phenomenal to provide not only the pathway and what's expected of individuals and communicating that in a very specific way, identifying the goals in a very specific way, visualizing them, communicating them in a variety of different ways, which meets the needs of all learners, and then connecting them to assessments because of the rubric that allow lots of different options. And again, digital tools that potentially facilitate that, like the use of video and other types of components. But also, it's the focus that the issue of tackling is engagement. And engagement, of course, a lot of initial conversations were, how do we get the learner to make sure they're on the camera? Or how do we make sure that they're engaged in whatever we're asking them to do remotely? To now, it's this conversation about, well, wait, let's better understand what it means to engage. And for example, how do we facilitate the development of self-monitoring skills? And that whole conversation of executive functions, that's an issue that I'm hearing a lot of districts trying to tackle, which I think is very beneficial to a variety of learners we're talking about. Individuals that can't set priorities, don't have the ability to identify and organizing, the abilities that individuals' abilities, disabilities or challenges with memory and things of that nature. That's an element often face-to-face that we tend to ignore or we tend to facilitate in a different way, but yet blended and fully online has a high expectation of that. Now, of course, I mentioned universal design for learning, and several people mentioned that as well. But UDL offers a lot of different ways and a lot of different formats to facilitate that. And so I'll stay there just because some of the resources that you'll be referred to kind of reinforce that as a framework to be able to facilitate some of that planning and designing. The list goes on. Definitely there's conversations about the law, as Kelsey's mentioned, and Ray has reinforced as well. But sadly, OSEP has not been as clear as they could be in respect to that. And I know there's been a lot of conversations at the national and state level in terms of being able to have some guidance, but also flexibility. And of course, the digital tool conversation, and I could go on from there. But those are primary things I'm seeing trying to be tackled. And what I see positively trying to be tackled is that they're rethinking, they're thinking outside the box. And in so doing, they're coming up with outside the box solutions that are, to me, more relevant from an equitable perspective for individuals that tend to oftentimes be left off to the side because we're planning for the middle and forgetting about the margins. So again, more of a positive light on this, but I totally hear what Kelsey and Ray are sharing in terms of some of the challenges as well. So.
Excellent. I like the fact that we have such a diverse perspective from our panelists as well. It's really sparking some great conversation in the chat group. I do want to draw our attention to a question that has come from Derek. He asks if any of the panel have experience with true partnerships between health, social agencies, and special education services in education in the redesign of our education system to enhance the education experience for all children and their families. He goes on to say, beyond simply involving them for special input, rather as a genuine partner in caring for and serving these learners and families. Does anyone want to take that?
I can respond. So I think initially that's that community piece that I think is going to be more and more important as we move through these phases. But we saw early on, and Ray and I've talked a lot about this, where there were some districts and communities that really came together and identified that some of the broader gaps. And so companies could come forth and ensure that all families had access to Wi-Fi. In my community, for an example, there was a consortium of restaurants that came together to ensure that all of the kiddos that are at home had access to at least one meal during the day, and coordinated efforts to provide those meals to support the school district. And then also partnering with mental health centers to help with some of the social and emotional pieces that families are dealing with. So I think we're starting to see some communities and districts come together in partnerships in the way that we haven't had to before, because the districts a lot of times have been able to be very self-sufficient, self-contained, very autonomous within a community. But now we're seeing with students spread across all of these different learning contexts that we have to rethink that now.
Thank you, Kelsey. Any of the other panelists, Sean or Ray, do you want to respond to that question as well?
I haven't seen a whole community. We've seen parts, and I think that's where Kelsey was talking about, where in some case, and I think it was Austin, Texas, where the metro system has buses that have Wi-Fi, and so they were parking buses in areas where there was less accessibility to the internet. So there have been pieces of it, but I haven't seen the whole community, although I did see an article, and I can't remember where it was, that I think I sent it to Kelsey at one point. I would like to add a couple more things though, Jean.
Please.
Kick it back to you a little bit. We know that people are doing stuff that's online and remote learning. The thing that people also need to know is there are some standards for quality online learning. And so I wanted you to do a little commercial there about the national quality standards for online learning, because I think it's a relevant piece. But before you do that, I just read today that a group of organizations, some of which we know, have put together a back-to-school rubric, version 2.0. I don't have the link for it, because it was happening just before we got started that I saw it. But a back-to-school rubric V2 will come up with it. And that's designed to help some school districts. And I think those are going to be more useful to the school districts that Sean was talking about, and less useful for some of the problem children in our environment. But Jean, how about talking about those standards?
Yeah, thank you, Ray. Just a quick mention about it. I'm sure many of you are familiar that years ago, INACL initiated the conversation around quality online standards for quality programs, quality teaching, and quality learning itself. And those standards have continued to be updated. Some of you may be aware that over the last, I think it's probably been the last 2 years, Quality Matters, along with the Virtual Learning Alliance, came together to update and revise those standards. Many of us had opportunity to give feedback on those standards during various presentations over either in DLAC or, of course, in the INACL symposiums along the way as well. At this point, many of you are probably well aware that Quality Matters continues to review courses against those standards, and the expectation, of course, is that publishers and school districts who are creating their own material are looking at those standards as really important guidelines in order for you to think about what does that quality experience in an online program really look like. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I can place a link into the chat or into our resources as well.
And to connect that all back to where we are today, both Quality Matters rubric and the national standards have a section on accessibility.
Absolutely, they do.
That's where I was.
Yes, absolutely, they do. Natalie, let's go on to the next slide real quickly here. We have been addressing questions throughout the conversation, and certainly we'd like to offer this time to invite you as audience members to address the panel with any other questions you have. If you have a specific question for a panelist, just put their name in the chat so I know who to direct the question to. And if it's more of a general comment, then I will just throw out your question and let whoever would like to tackle that one to do so. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for you to generate any further questions that you might have, I'll call your attention again to just the great conversation that's happening in the chat. Houston has provided a number of resources in response to Derek's question as well. And so lots of good information that is emerging there. And Derek just posted a link to the back to school rubric, Ray. So there it is. We have it available for our audience in just in the right nick of time here. So.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in on a different issue because we've been talking a lot about accessibility. I have hinted at the race issue. I want to point out that historically we have seen school districts not being, some school districts qualify, some school districts, not all school districts, some school districts who are not thinking very strongly about the racial issues. I've got a school district that I know of years ago where all of their Hispanic and African American students were directed to face-to-face AP courses, and all the white Anglo students were directed to online AP courses. They're all getting AP, but there was an assumption made by, and it was determined by Office for Civil Rights, that it was in fact the guidance counselors who were directing students to different types of programs based on assumptions and stereotypes that they were making. So we need to be keeping in mind that the equity issues are not just about students with disabilities. They're not just about students who are English language learners. There are Black and brown students that need to be included in all these discussions as well.
Thank you, Ray. You know, this actually is a good time for us to transition to our closing thoughts as we begin to wind down our session a little bit. And I do want to point out again, hard to keep up with all this. You guys are busy here, but Kelsey has also posted a link to the journal with an article that again talks about districts identifying areas of improvement for fall return. So Natalie, let's go to the next slide real quickly, because as we come towards the close of our session, I really would like to invite each of our panelists to share their closing thoughts. And in addition, you might like to also highlight the resources that you have curated and made available for members of our audience who would like to learn more about equity. So I'll leave it open to who would like to start first. Okay, I'll pick on Ray, but you have to unmute yourself.
No, I nominate Kelsey.
Oh, you did.
Can you hear me?
We can, Kelsey, thank you.
Okay, my screen is frozen, so, okay. Yeah, closing thoughts, takeaways. So for me, one of the kind of aha moments that I had during COVID is when we think about technology and accessibility, particularly for students with disabilities, I have had to put on additional lenses. So again, at the beginning of the conversation, we said we can't think about accessibility in terms of just access to hardware and making digital hardware work for all learners, but also access to software, and then also access to academic content and access to educational activities. And so I think if we can continue to broaden our understanding of what access really means for all of our learners, then when we are being intentional in our planning and responding back to needs in the field, that we can continue to be more innovative, think more outside of the box, continue to pull in resources that we didn't think were needed or even available, specifically from the community, but also with each other and rethinking our roles. And this is what I hear from my colleagues in the field, a wonderful opportunity to rethink. I saw somebody put, and I don't necessarily know that this is true across the country, but this factory model of kind of this one size fits all that we tend to do because we're bogged down with regulations and policy, but maybe rethink that in a way that we can better get quality education to all of our kiddos.
Excellent. Kelsey, and did you have any resources that you wanted to highlight for our audience?
Let's see. I've been dropping links in, so I will make sure I have all of those dropped in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelsey. Sean, how about you? Would you like to go next with your closing thoughts?
Sure. So first of all, thank you much for the opportunity to be here. So I thoroughly enjoyed and learned a lot from Ray and Kelsey and of course, Jean. So as folks have probably figured out, of course, as I think about equity, I tend to think about where my home is, and that is individuals with disabilities and struggling learners, which of course I think is inclusive to a broader group as well. But with that in mind, you know, I think of several different things, and particularly at this time, one of my closing thoughts is I think a colleague of mine, Young Zhao, he's a distinguished faculty member here at the School of Education in the University of Kansas, and he talks about how educational crisis is a chance for transformational change.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do see a lot of challenges, and there need to be selection, there need to be solutions through policy and legislation and things of that nature. And there need to be definitely transformational change, no question. But with that, I see the opportunity that the hybrid and blended is forcing us to do some of these things. And I could talk about this in a variety of different ways, but I'll just leave it with the digital tools that I said in my introduction I tend to lead with. Digital solutions have been out there for a variety of our learners that when the schools have invested in these devices, and of course, they're not necessarily all dependent upon Wi-Fi, but when Wi-Fi is available, which I'd argue over the last 5 months has dramatically changed in terms of access, and hopefully over the next year will continue to change in terms of legislation that's providing that, as well as in areas that need it. With those tools can really make a significant difference, and the literature's been there for years when it comes to learning, literacy, when it comes to social emotional growth, when it comes to engagement. They're not the only solution, but they're an element that to me, levels the field to a degree. It provides some of those supports that other individuals may have internal to them, but other individuals need the external. And with those solutions, and we mentioned briefly like word prediction, text to speech, things of that nature, that really alters the instructional and learning process, can really make, again, a transformational change. And so I've spent years trying to integrate technology into the lives of students with disabilities. And I can tell you, and it's more than just assistive technology, and I can tell you, oh my goodness, the war stories about the lack of success. I think that issue is increasingly going to disappear due to what's happening here. And it's more going to be more how to better integrate, how to better all learners. I'm hopeful that, but I'm seeing signs of that. And that's, I hope, is a takeaway through the use of these technologies through design and planning that can really be transformational for the individuals we're trying to serve. So I'll keep it there. Oh, and resource-wise, I mentioned School Virtually, which is for educators and parents, something we created, some colleagues and I created back in April, specifically for those thinking about universal design for learning and online learning. We've tried to make a very specific connection there. But also, we're going to share a folder in just a moment. And I put up a number of different presentations and a number of different resources on everything from assessment to engagement to planning and designing that might be helpful. And feel free to email if any of those things need further clarity or if I can be of further help. So.
Thank you, Sean. You know, one of the interesting conversations that I think is important for us to have is how will we bring the lessons learned through this pandemic, when the pandemic ends, to meaningful change that impacts what we do in schools. So I'm really, really interested in the conversation about what's going to stick, right? How are we going to make meaningful change happen? Ray, let me give you the last opportunity for closing thoughts here.
This is going to be fun. Actually, the thing that I think is most important here, and I think both Sean and Kelsey have alluded to it, schools aren't going to change, aren't going to recover and go back to the old normal. We've got something that's much more than the normal. Now, it's going to vary with schools as to whether they make a radical change or not. But we've got teachers that have never taught in an online situation before in remote learning. They have done that. Some of them love it. Some of them don't love it. But there's going to be changes. There are going to be changes in schools. What I'm hoping is that we will see a broader participation in community and who is represented in the planning for the future of education. I know that when people were signing in, we had a couple people from universities who were doing teacher preparation. I sincerely hope that you will make changes in your program to reflect, hey, how to teach using Zoom, how to select resources, digital resources. Um, the changes that we have seen happen need to carry over into our ongoing education process. And I am sincerely hoping that that is going to happen.
And Ray, are there resources that you've posted that you would like to highlight for the audience?
We picked up a couple already with the national standards. Thank you, Derek, for the back to school rubric. And we're picking up those. And I think the quote for excessive OCR is there. If somebody has questions and they want to get in touch with me, I'm putting my email address in chat right now. So I can answer some questions from that too.
Excellent, thank you. And Sean has also posted his. I don't know if Kelsey can do so because her screen is frozen, but there she is. So you now have the email addresses for all three of our panelists, and feel free to reach out for them. Kelsey also posted for us the national standards for quality, for quality teaching, online teaching. So I invite you to take a look at that as well. Natalie, let's go to the next slide because I want to make sure that our audience knows that we have provided a QR code to give you access to the resources that our panelists have curated for you. And that will take you to some excellent resources, along with many that you have posted, quite frankly, and shared with one another in the context of our webinar today. So hopefully you will have many, many directions to look for more information. Let's go on to the next slide. So in closing, I would just like to extend our thanks to the Aurora Institute for inviting us to participate in this important conversation. And I want to thank each of our panelists for sharing their expertise and their insights into the challenges and the opportunities that are before us as we address equity for all students. But most importantly, I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your very busy days to join us for the conversation today. With that, I wish you all a good day.
Thank you all so much for joining us today and for the wonderful engagement and dialogue in the chat box. And please join me in giving a warm thank you to our terrific group of panelists today. That was such an insightful conversation and we were delighted to be a part of it. In closing here, I invite you as attendees to perhaps share one takeaway that you learned during today's session. We'd really love to learn from you and hear your tokens that you're going to take with you into the future today. And as a reminder, today's session is going to be recorded, transcribed, and sent to you all via email. And we've mentioned a lot of resources during today's session. We'll be sure to share those resources with you as well. So you'll have access to all of that. And we hope you'll consider joining us for our upcoming webinars leading up to the symposium this year. There are a few on the slide here for you today. There are many more on our website. So please go check out aurorainstitute.org and register to attend. And we hope to see you soon in future webinars. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are hosting our virtual Aurora Institute Symposium on October 26th to the 28th. So stay tuned for more details there, and we hope to see you register and attend for that as well. And with that, thank you again to our panelists. Thank you again for everyone who attended, and we hope to see you soon. Take care and be well. Bye-bye.